Hey guys, today on the Ready State, we've got Coach Sean here and myself, Coach Diane Fu, doing a live case study with a question that just came in from one of our coaches. We're gonna do this case study giving you kind of our insight into our thinking, both from the physical therapy perspective and also from kind of the on-the-ground coaching perspective on how we solve and troubleshoot these problems. The question came in, I am now trying to figure out a common athlete problem I am starting to see slightly more and more lately, a shifting in the bottom of the squat. Noticing a few athletes who like to come out of the squat by shifting the right or left foot, and this shift can be seen as a noticeable shear in the lower back, which then aggravates the SI and lower lumbar. Sean, what do you think?
Well, a shift in weight is a problem-solving thing that an athlete will do unconsciously if they're not feeling secure with the plan that they're using, if they have a mobility deficit, or if there's some common pathologies or injuries that might be present that present at the bottom of that squat position. From the therapy side of things, the first thing that I want to do is clear full hip range of motion. If you have a stiff hip, as you go down, one side's gonna stop and you're gonna have to move off of that. And you might see that as a rotation. You might see that as a shift in weight to kind of keep going more on the more mobile side. I also, one of my very first questions would be, does this athlete have a history of a significant injury on one of their limbs? Because if they were, had their ACL reconstructed or had a bad ankle injury that had to be immobilized for a period of time, if they have a strength imbalance, the body is going to naturally try to use the strongest limb to generate the force to stand up, especially from that full, deep, heavy squat. And so if one side's stronger than the other, you'll commonly see a shift towards that strong side if there is a side-to-side difference in strength.
So the noticing is the same as, in the areas in which we have space, the body will move to naturally occupy that space. And I oftentimes see that in athletes where there is either that stiffness issue, or if it's not a stiffness issue, when we kind of check general range of motion under tempo, right? When we slow the movement down and really get a chance to see what's going on in the rhythm and the range of motion in the corners of the athlete, then the next solve for me would be to take a look at, is there a strength deficit on one side or the other?
Right.
Yeah.
After that, if the hip flexibility is generally symmetrical and they don't have some major injury history that might make them wildly different strength-wise, one leg to the other, therapy-wise, the next thing I'm thinking is there either a leg length discrepancy or is there some kind of scoliosis going on in the spine? So if there is a natural twist in the spine, so if instead of being symmetrical, I have a little twist in the bottom of the spine, well, I'm gonna come up, I'm gonna want to do something like this because there is a natural twist or there's a little rotation that's gonna happen in the bottom, because that is kind of a reflection of that three-dimensional spinal mechanic where we're used to thinking of a spine. We're really just trying to control it in one dimension, sagittal plane, not lose overextension or overflexion. But if there's a tilting or rotation also happening in the pelvis or in the lumbopelvic area, then this can show up in that deep squat as kind of a shift or rotation that is hard to resist.
Now, that feels real interesting for me. So my question for you is,
Yeah.
If there is an imbalance, how would the coach work to see that on their athlete?
Well, so there's a really common and pretty simple test for this, which is to just have someone stand up, they kind of lift their shirt up so you can see the spine, you just have them bend forward. And in a normal person, you'll see a very straight row of spinous processes. And if you see a little deviation in that, even if it's not clinically relevant, under 10 degrees of a curve, that wouldn't be something that would have caught the attention of a pediatrician, for someone as an adolescent. But that might be relevant enough when you apply a heavy load that starts to express itself as a small shift. You might also see more muscle on one side of the spine than the other. And this doesn't have to be structural either. If it's a person who played a lot of asymmetrical sports, like a batter or a golfer or a volleyball player, they might have developed one side more than their other side, and you'll see more muscle on one side of the spine than the other. So, that common just forward bend test can give you a lot of information. And then the other thing that we'll look for is a hip height measurement. And this is kind of that classic, if you stand up, as long as you're comfortable putting your hands on somebody, I want to see, is the height of the hips the same on both sides? And you kind of get down and you can see, if one hand is higher and the other hand is lower, then you may be thinking that there's something going on with the leg length or the pelvic positioning there. And that can show up as wanting to shift one side to the other. And if you're already talking about having SI issues, then that pelvic shift can be a component of that SI problem. So, it could be a feedback mechanism. It could be the SI as a consequence of this, or it could be that the squat moving like that is a consequence of having an SI issue underlying. So there's a number of different ways that can kind of end up looking like this.
Right. So then as a strength coach, when I'm taking a look at an athlete with, these imbalances, whether or not I know it's an SI, whether or not I've solved, or leg length, whatever anthropometry the athlete's coming in with, my typical strategy is I default to isometrics, right?
Absolutely.
I default to getting everything around the hip structure as strong as possible to be able to support the joints.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And then, maybe one of the final pieces I'll take a look at is also maybe peppering in some unilateral work. And
Absolutely.
I have had athletes who feel maybe right side dominant. When we're doing unilateral work, start doing an extra set on the other side. I have taken it too far before. That can be a separate reel in itself, where I had my athlete do an extra set on the less dominant side, and I'll leave that as a cliffhanger, how that sorted out on the other end. But as a physical therapist, how would you take a look at this issue, and how would you start to, if it is a SI joint issue, how would you start to solve that?
Many of these types of issues, I want to start from the foundation up. One of the other presentations could be having a flat foot or a flattened arch on one side or the other, which functionally will change the length of that limb, because if you're dropping the foundation, even if it's just a centimeter or two on one side, that might show up in that bottom of the squat. So I'll have that person go barefoot first, coach that person through good 3-point foot contact, balanced pressure. And, if we're trying to solve this from a motor control standpoint, if hypothetically there isn't a mobility issue or a major mobility issue, then we do have to kind of solve this by coaching that athlete through how does it supposed to feel when they stay symmetrical. Whatever reason, they learned that it feels normal to shift their weight. So they have to kind of unlearn that. And I always start extra proprioception barefoot on the floor and teach them what it feels like to alter their balance of pressure so they can start to interpret that internally during the squat. Really, really helpful to slow things down. That tempo and isometrics is really, really important. And there's going to be a point as they're symmetrically lowering down where they want to shift. So we want to go slow enough that they can feel that first moment that they want to have maybe 60-40 pressure. That's the bottom of that squat. And then we can see, well, do we need to cue just a little more pressure, a little more rooting into the other side? Or does that have to be the bottom of the squat for right now while we solve whatever issue is going on?
Yeah, so typically the strategy I would come in and adopt, and I really like how you're actually taking it all the way down to the foot, right? Taking a look at kind of, either whether or not the foot pressure is even on either side. For me, how I've solved that, traditionally is we kind of backfill it a little bit, and we use isometrics to go, okay, this is where the shift is happening. Let's stop you a level above that, right? Start to solve for maybe any, mobility, flexibility deficits, and then what we'll do is we'll use isometrics to continue lowering that ramp as the athlete's able to maintain that control.
Yeah, and that's where I'll use, like you were saying, the unilateral work is I want to see if I can express good hip function and see if I can take them all the way through range, because ultimately, if it's a flexibility problem, you need to go get that flexibility, but then you still have a motor control problem where you have to unlearn that. If there isn't the flexibility problem, you get to skip to step 2, but you still have to unlearn that. And that's where just doing it on one side, forcing them to kind of keep that, moving down a track, feeling like they're not just kind of floating through that, can be a useful way of solving that. Because again, you don't want to just solve this problem by saying like, well, you only get 3/4 of the squat. We're just going to cut the bottom out.
That's all you get.
But there might be an intermediate time where we are going very slow. Maybe we're putting some pauses in. I've always described this as, you want to take like a prosciutto slice off the depth of your bottom. You're not taking like the whole ham sandwich out. Like just want just the littlest little bit. I'm hungry, so.
In your experience, like, time-wise, like how long does it take for, challenges like weight shift, that foot rotation because of whatever is causing it at the root, to be able to see a shift that's going to stick?
Right. Well, so assuming that this is a learning problem, it's 1 minute to infinity minutes. Like that's, the 10,000 hours plus or minus 10,000. If you have someone who has a fairly small problem, they're very proprioceptively in tune, they're just a very fast movement learner, that's kind of their physical intelligence is their special kind of intelligence. All you have to do is show them that what their natural solution is not working for this specific reason of the hip shift. You present this alternative version, and if that's the only barrier, then they'll just try to do it the way that you showed them how to do it, and that can be like an instantaneous fix. If there's more practice built up around this, if this is more of a long-standing problem and that person's been training through it, they may have built themselves into an imbalance. And now you have, this deficit of you have to start to correct that imbalance. But you don't want to just say like, oh, you shifted to the right. Let's make the same error to the left. Right. So it's hard. You're not going to necessarily solve that by just letting the pendulum swing too far the other way, which happens a lot as you try to correct something. Very commonly we overcorrect and we have to come back towards the center. So that is a little harder, and that's where I find that unilateral work. But you might have to go through a full unilateral linear strength cycle of 6 to 12 weeks, depending on how developed they have built this. If it's a fairly recent phenomenon and their muscular development is still pretty even, it can be a very simple straight fix.
Right. Yeah, my experience has been like, and I'll reference and use Olympic style weightlifting as a proxy, is when I get these athletes that have a very seasoned playbook of movement underneath their belt, and they're coming in and retooling their movement, typically the experience is that it takes a good solid 3 months up to 6 to really get the groove to get deep enough that it sticks.
Yeah, I would say that's true. And I think speed plays a big element to this. We've talked a lot about slowing things down. Well, a lot of people who are very good athletes, you show them what you expect and they can do that at slow speeds. But when the chips are down and they're trying to, catch a 1 rep max snatch, their true colors are going to show. And that's just because, your body in the moment that is critical will do the thing that it has learned will be successful. Your body in that critical moment when you shut brain off and do, it just does whatever you've trained to be the most successful thing, whether that's painful, whether that's symmetrical, asymmetrical, whatever successful is successful, because we're programmed to accomplish physical tasks. We're not programmed to do it in a very specific way. So you have to hardwire that into the system until the new way is the most successful way when the chips are down. And that, like you said, can take, especially if someone's trained heavily, it can take, a good long 3 to 6 months of hard work. It's not just, I showed this person something one time, they did an air squat perfectly and they were fixed. Like you have to backfill that with all of the practice that it takes to relearn the way those positions are meant to feel.
Right, and sometimes when the nuance is as soft as something as a few degree shift of the hips or the foot, right? In the body, it interprets it. What I find is it can interpret it close enough where you really have to pay attention to get into that right groove, and that groove can take a little while to develop.
Absolutely.
Right. Sean, thank you so much. I really appreciated your insight.
Thank you.